Hi there and welcome along to this Excel video. What I want to look at today is a workaround for pivot charts. Now pivot charts don't work on a Mac. They do work on a PC, but they have some limitations and a lot of people don't like them because of those limitations. What I've been doing for the last 6 months on a number of my projects is using pivot tables and slices just as part of my workings process, and I've been using the data to create a regular dynamic chart rather than a pivot chart. So let's have a look at this example in front of us here. We've got a set of data. That data is going into a pivot table based upon the selection of a player, and we can use this slicer to change the content of the chart. Even if there's a different number of data points on the chart, it updates perfectly. Now this is not a pivot chart, this is a regular chart. Second example that we'll have a look at is even more complicated. We've got the ability to select which variable we want to display on the chart using a slicer. And once again, this is not a pivot chart, it's just a regular chart. But we can interact with these two slices however we like, just like as if it was a pivot chart. Final example is using heart rate data. We've got 3 heart rate zones. I can just show one of them. I can hold the control key down and show 2 of them, or all of them. And similarly with the dates, I can select the dates that I want, or clear the filter and show everything. So let's have a look at how we might construct these from scratch. The first thing that I want to do, however, is just do a simple pivot chart example. Here we have a few players and we have body weights for about 8 or 9 days. It's formatted as an Excel table. I can go straight in and create a pivot table. I want to put it on an existing worksheet right next to our data. Using the pivot table wizard, I pull name into filter, date into rows, and body weight into the values quadrant. And I don't really need to tidy this up because it's just an example, but if I was to select an athlete, I could get all of their data over the course of this period of time. I could then insert a pivot chart. A line chart is always a good option for longitudinal data. Hide the field buttons. Tidy the chart up a little bit. And it's actually not too bad. Without a lot of effort, I can see what the trend of this athlete's body weight is. If I click inside the pivot table, I can go to the Analyze tab and insert a slicer for athlete name. I can reformat that slightly, and I've now got the ability to chop and change from athlete to athlete and see all of their data. Now that's a piece of cake if you're on a PC, but as I mentioned previously, that pivot chart step does not work on a Mac. So let's go and have a look at our previous example, but start from the beginning. I've got a data set. Instead of body weight this time, I've got a distance covered, so this is obviously an extract from some GPS unit. Step 1, convert to a table. I'm going to call it example 1. Click Insert Pivot Table, put it on an existing worksheet. Pull player into the filter, date into the rows, and distance into the values. And just to get us started, I'm going to select a single individual. With my cursor inside the pivot table, I insert slicer using player. I'm trying to keep everything really tight together, so apologies if it's all sitting on top of each other a little bit. Just makes it easier to view on the screen when it's in one group. So we've now got a slicer that interacts with this pivot table. Now you'll notice that when you select a name using the slicer, that cell F1 changes. That's because the slicer is impacting on the filter area of the pivot table. And so we've got a controller for this cell here, F1. If I want to create a dynamic chart that's not a pivot table, I need a little workings area. So I'm going to give it a heading here so that I can get started. The player that I'm selecting can be found in F1. If I do a direct cell reference, it's going to update anytime I click on a different person in this slicer. If I want to create a custom title for this chart, I could do so using text functions. In quotes, I could do something like this, and with an ampersand I can add on the athlete's name at the end. So I've now got a custom title. Haven't got any data yet, but I've got custom title all ready to go once my chart has been built. The next thing I want to do is create a counter. How many sets of data are there? And I can do that by simply doing a count. The function count will do that for me. And if I select all the way down to 20 something rows, it doesn't matter too much, it's going to give me a number 5. It didn't count grand total because that's text. The other option I could have would be to turn off the grand totals, which would be my preference anyway, but either way that count is going to be okay. So it's telling us that there's 5 sets of data. To make my formula easier, I'm just going to put a row incrementer here for us. These are my column headings. I'm going to write an if equation. If this number, and I want to lock it, the column but not the row, if that number is greater than our number of items, which is 5 for this athlete, then I need to leave it blank. Otherwise, I need this number here, E4. Have to reformat that because it's seeing it as a number, change it to short date, and we're in business. If I drag this across to the right, change it again, the format to a number, we actually have a data set that we can use to chart now. If I put a different athlete in here, we can see that the data is changing. Roger's got more data and it grows automatically. Because this counter now says 6, the 6th row of the table appears. So we've got a data set which we can now use to create a dynamic range and then build a dynamic chart. So just to the right here, I'm just going to put down what our range names are, just to help you go through this process yourself later. Let's call the first one dynamic range example 1 dates, dynamic range example 1 distances. Something simple like that is useful. Now let's go to define name. We can see because I had one of those names selected, it auto-populates it. So let's do that one first. A dynamic range is something I've covered previously. Our range is always going to start here. That's always where the first date's going to be. It's a bit harder to find out where the end is, however. So we need to use an index function to do that. Our data is going to end somewhere in this range as defined by this counter. And it's always going to be one column wide. Let's do that again for the other range. It's always going to start there. And it's going to end somewhere in this range as defined by this counter, and it's always one wide. And so if I go to the name manager, we can see we've got our two names in there. If I choose distances and click on the finder, the little dash lines are telling us that we're on track. Alright, let's try and create a really quick chart. Insert, we can use a column chart. Right click and choose select data. We need to replace what is a direct cell reference with the named range that we just created. So I backspace all the way until I get to the exclamation point, because that's the sheet reference. Hit the F3 key on a PC and choose distances. If you're on a Mac, you'll probably have to type that in. We created a custom title, so let's use it. And we're now ready to go. If I select a name, the slicer changes the content of the pivot table. It also changes these cells here, which are giving us the chart title. The pivot table is also changing the data that's in our little workings area, and that is changing our chart. So we've got our own little pivot chart without having to use the built-in pivot chart function. So if you open this chart on a version of Excel for Mac, it'll work okay. As long as you're using Excel for Mac 2016, that these slices will then work. Let's check out a second example. First step is create a table. Give it a name. Always a good idea to follow these processes, in my opinion. Insert a pivot table on an existing worksheet. Keep it as tight as possible. Let's pull date into the filter, player into the row labels, and our four variables into the values area. And let's get rid of that wizard. Just going to abbreviate these column headings. And what that does is, as soon as you select something, it narrows everything down. So I just want to have a little bit less space occupied with this pivot table. With my cursor inside the pivot table, I want to insert a slicer for date. I can reduce that down in size a bit, and I can check that it's working simply by clicking on a date, and I can see the data updating. Because I want a second slicer, I need to if you like, falsify one. And this is what I mean by a phantom slicer. I'm going to create a list of variables that I want to use in my slicer just by typing some text in. In my case, I just copied and pasted the column headings from the table. Now with that set of info selected, I'm going to insert a pivot table, and I'm going to put it immediately below my little table of data. The only thing I can do is drag that variable somewhere. I'm going to put it in the rows. Turn off the grand totals. Click inside this new phantom pivot table. Insert a slicer. Format that slicer a little bit and put it next to my other one. Now if we click on this slicer, we can see that now this cell is changing. It's always cell N8. So we can use that to extract some information from our data table. So do a direct link to the date slicer. So we've got our date for the chart title. Let's get our variable. Currently it says sprints. And we can put that together now. And if I just do that, you think it would look alright, but the problem is Excel doesn't like mixed cell formats, so the text function is great for this. And so that's the format I use on my side of the world, and that fixes up that mixed format problem perfectly. So we've now got our titles and things like that. We just need to get our chart data sorted. Just like previously, I'm going to create a bit of space for growth here. If I drag that down to 20, that seems like that'll be enough. I need a counter. Just like previously, I can do that with a simple count function. This time when you're counting text, you use count A. I want to know how many athletes have data on this particular day. So we've got that counter in place now. We can write our if function. If this row counter is greater than 5, then do a blank, otherwise give us whatever is in this cell. Double click, send it down, and we get what we want. This one's a little bit trickier. That's our column heading. It currently says sprints, but if we choose distance, it'll show distance as well. It's just a direct cell link to the filter area of our phantom pivot table and slicer set. Need one more row above, so I'm just going to lower this down a little bit, maybe 2, just to create a space. With the match function, I need to identify where our selected variable is in our group of variables. This counter 1 is telling us that distance is the first variable, high speed running is the second, max velocity the fourth, and sprints the third. And so I can use that to drive a function called choose. If I lock that down on Q6, I now have to identify where my four options are. The first option, distance, is in I4. I have to be careful here. If I click inside the table, I'll get this huge getPivotData function automatically inside my table. There's a way to stop that happening, but I don't want to go into that just yet. So I'm simply going to use my eyes to see that that is I4. If instead they chose high speed running, that would be J4. If they chose max velocity, that would be L4, a little bit out of sequence there, or K4. Double click, send that down. We've got those zeros, so we can put the if equation in to get rid of them. Send that down again, and our table is updating just like that. So let's follow the same sequence as previously. We've got our two dynamic range names. Let's define the name. Starts there. Using the index function, we can find out where it's going to finish based upon the counter. It's always one column wide. Second one, good practice here. Always starts in cell R9. Index function tells us whereabouts it's going to finish. And we're now ready to go, so I'm going to insert just a basic column chart. Let's link the title. We can probably tidy this up a little bit more by putting the variable in there. There we go. Right click, choose select data, series name, backspace the absolute cell references and replace it with our dynamic ranges that we've created. I'm just going to lump this over here, put it over the data. So we can now choose date. We could choose multiple dates. The chart title is going to be messed up a little bit, but that's okay. But the real trick to this chart is that we can choose our variable using a slicer, even though it's not interacting at all with our pivot table. It's only interacting with our little formula driven workings area. And so there's all sorts of stuff you could now do, such as adding data labels and so on, but let's not worry about that. I would certainly change this axis so that the values start further towards 0, but That's all stuff that's easy for you to do yourselves. The real important thing is that we're able to have this chart be linked to slices without the use of a pivot chart. So one more example here, it is using a heart rate data set. We've got a date, an athlete name, and then a number of minutes in each of 3 zones. Let's insert a pivot table, put it right next to our table, and let's drag in player name to rows, dates to filter, and our 3 zone data sets into the values. Just going to replace these column headings with something a bit more brief, and as soon as I select a date, that'll all squash down. So we've got a little bit more real estate to work with now. Get rid of the grand totals, and everything's nice and contained now. I'm going to set up my phantom pivot table again like I did in the last example, but this time I'm going to write some custom labels that we can use as much more descriptive slices, like so. Now if I select all of that, insert a pivot table directly underneath, drag heart rate zones into rows, and get rid of that. We've now got a little pivot table, and just like previously, we can insert a slicer from those zones as well. Let's see what happens. It's interacting just fine, and if I clear it, all 3 is showing. So I've got a little bit of a problem here. I can't directly link to a cell, because if I've only selected zone 3, that goes in cell L7. If I select 2, it shuffles things around a little bit. So I need to be a bit more clever here. And that cleverness is just about saying, is my selection somewhere in this area? The match function will tell me whether or not zone 1 has been selected. If it has been selected, it's going to be somewhere in this area of 3 cells. So as you can see, we've got one zone not selected, and that says NA. If I hold my control key down and select it, it shows as a number now. To make it a little bit more elegant, I'm just going to put is number. That'll give us trues and falses. Let's set up our chart workings area. First thing we can do is click on the date. Then we can create a title. Next we can put in a counter. So this counter is to find out how many athletes. So count A is the one we want because that counts text values. So we know, same as last time, we've got 5 people. So let's set up our data table. Let's assume we're only ever going to have 10 people. Similar trick to before. If our row incrementer is greater than our counter, then leave it blank. Otherwise, give us whoever's in cell G4. Double click and send that down. Now this next one's going to be a little bit more complicated. We still want to go through this row incrementer process. But instead of going straight and clicking inside the table, I need to do another if. If this value is true, then we put the zone 1 data in. And that zone 1 data is in cell H4. Remember, I can't click inside the table, otherwise I'll get a big get pivot data function. And if it's false, I want to put an NA. What's good about NA is that it does not chart. So to have some NAs means that the chart series will be empty. I'm going to drag this across and I'm going to see what I have to edit. Looks like all I have to edit is dragging that down. Dragging that purple box down. It's one of the great things about some of the new versions of Excel. It allows you to interact with formula just by clicking inside the formula bar. You can see all the related fields and just adjust them as you need to. So we've got our data sets. Let's see what happens if I clear the filter. Everything appears. If I just select one, everything's adjusting great. So I'm going to build my dynamic ranges. Now that we've got those dynamic ranges, we can build our static chart and then convert it. So we want a chart that looks like this. Some pretty awful colors got put in there, but that's alright. Let's get our chart title sorted and right click and choose select data to edit the rest. So there we have a couple of slices now. We can choose our zone. The other ones then disappear from the chart because NAs do not plot. I could add another zone on, add another one, take it away. It's completely flexible. I can choose one date or multiple dates. The only thing that will happen if we do that is that the title gets a little bit messed up, but we could probably figure out a way to solve that. But let's not worry about that for now. What we know we can do is create these dynamic charts using pivot table data without having to rely on PivotCharts, simply by setting up a dummy area where you use some chart workings, and simply by creating a little workings area where you reference directly to cells inside the pivot table, and when you need to, you can also create your own phantom slices that aren't really interacting at all with the primary pivot table. All they're doing is interacting with your formula. So that's what I mean when I say a phantom slicer. I think I've seen that term used before in some Excel blogs, but it's definitely in my arsenal of tricks now, and I use it quite regularly. So if you want a copy of this file, all the 3 examples are inside the one file, then email me, and don't forget to reference this video number 76, and I should be back soon with something new. Cheers.